Hello and welcome to the 2025 MIFF Schools program. I'm Josh Nelson, and on behalf of all of the team at MIFF, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Here at MIFF, we continue to celebrate the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with the MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the films to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCAR, and also to subjects such as English and EAL, literature, media studies, and the film study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those curriculums, there's a real key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts and mediums. And this obviously becomes a really key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. So for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not as a replacement or as a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those key focus areas. While the MIFF Schools program is perhaps ideally suited to students within the French, Japanese, Mandarin, Italian, German and English language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a really diverse range of subjects, abilities and age groups, preparing students, as I mentioned, for those text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. Now, I'm going to focus on the film techniques and terminologies that students would ideally have a familiarity with in just a moment. But before I do that, here a brief synopsis of the film might be useful. Now, I should mention, this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid, as much as possible, giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the films themselves, while still providing you with an overview of the content of the film and suggesting some strategies and suggestions for analysis that should really help structure that post-screening and pre-screening classroom discussion and context. Spreadsheet Champions is an Australian-produced documentary exploring the dreams and aspirations of 6 young people from around the globe as they prepare to enter into a competition with a difference, a test of their elite mastery of Microsoft Excel at the Microsoft Office Specialist World Championships. Yes, you heard that right. If the idea of Microsoft Excel as a competitive sport might sound like a range error, for quirky US child prodigy Mason, laid-back Queensland teen Braden, the extroverted Guatemalan would-be YouTuber Carmina, diligent Nam from Vietnam, shy Alkmini from Greece, and ambitious Delapay from Cameroon, their intricate knowledge of the application is an opportunity for individual success and national glory. Gathering in Florida for the event, these teens and young adults from around the world demonstrate their mathematical prowess, problem-solving skills, and familiarity with the most obscure Excel formulas and functions. But who will reign supreme on the screen to be crowned the world's best competitive spreadsheeter? Following these competitors from their homes on 5 different continents to the pressure cooker environment of the championships, Australian filmmaker Christina Kraskov crafts an observational feature documentary that will delight fans of Spellbound, which played in MIFF in 2003, and The King of Kong. Both suspenseful and heartwarming, Spreadsheet Champions captures the challenge of performing at an elite level while also navigating the volatile, identity-forming time of adolescence. But before we look at this film in more detail, I do want to return to the terminology and techniques that I flagged at the beginning of the presentation, and that real core focus on developing students' visual literacy skills. And so I would actually recommend to teachers that prior to attending the screening, it might be really useful to either introduce, depending on the age level of the students, or at least revise a selection of key film terminology and techniques that students should really be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I realize I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining. Yes, films are fun. But there also needs to be that expectation placed upon students that they'll be watching these films in order to analyze them. Whether that's as part of a non-English language course, or English, EAL, media, or a film studies unit. And on that, I would actually suggest that students take notes, or be encouraged to take notes during the screening. It's one way to ensure that they're going to be actively engaging with what they're seeing on screen. Now, I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but just as a general overview of film techniques, something that might be beneficial prior to the screening, this might be a useful starting point. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether that's on YouTube or in, say, textbook form. I would also really emphasize from the outset that it's important that students can firstly identify the technique that's being used, that secondly, they can understand its general function in the context of film language and filmmaking, especially in terms of creating meaning within the film itself from a filmmaker's perspective. And then thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film's exploring. And it's very difficult to achieve that final outcome unless those first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, whether that's the close-up or a wide-angle shot or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, which incorporates elements such as props, costumes, the use of lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, music and also lyrics, sound, dialogue, the use of voiceover, editing, narrative structure and story elements, and also visual motifs and symbolism. And so, as I mentioned, these are effectively the building blocks of filmmaking. So it's really essential, I think, that students have an awareness of these and come into the screenings with that awareness. Okay, so looking at the film in a little more detail now. Some of the themes that are explored within Spreadsheet Champions, things like competition, coping under pressure, technology, data literacy, education, the theme of family and community, cultural differences or cultural similarities as well, intellect and the value of intellect in a broader sense, neurodiversity is absolutely an element within this film, and also I think one of the themes that really binds a number of those together is this question about the meaning of success. You know, what does it mean to succeed, not just in the context of the championship, but in life more broadly? When I approach a film text with a class, I often like to start from the big picture and then gradually work my way towards the focused film analysis of key scenes or sequences or whatever that might be. There are a number of contexts here that I think you could, either prior to the screening or certainly in that follow-up, elaborate on some of the kind of broader cultural, social themes and issues that this film is dealing with. So while the film is focused on the Microsoft Office Specialist World Championships in Florida, it touches on a number of other topics and issues that I think could be elaborated on further, which I think would provide ample material to further contextualize and develop the students' understandings of the documentary and the themes that the film is exploring. So one could be the championship itself, and I've listed a reference to that championship website, which goes into detail about the sort of specifics of the competition. The film also touches on contemporary debates regarding artificial intelligence. Again, this is something we are hearing a lot about in the news. It's one of the reasons this film is particularly timely in many regards. And I think students having a greater awareness and understanding of that and the kinds of implications of AI is really critical at the moment. The film also touches on questions of technology in the classroom and the role of technology in the classroom. There's also a gender component to this in terms of women in STEM and that push to provide a sense of equality in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, fields that tend to be dominated historically by men. And I think one other really key issue that the film touches on, which could be discussed in more depth, is the inequality in terms of access, not just to technology, but to the internet as well. It's certainly something the film deals with through at least one or two of the main subjects within the film. Another context that I think might be a valuable approach to take, and again, we would tailor this to the age level and the academic level of the students attending, is to look at it through the lens of documentary filmmaking. So, as I've sort of intimated already, Spreadsheet Champions shines a spotlight on a number of pertinent social and cultural issues regarding education, competition, globalization, and technology. So students should really consider what the aims of the filmmaker may have been in setting out to make this film. So, for example, what kinds of documentary techniques does the filmmaker employ in order to inform or to sway the audience's minds about the subjects and the topics that are presented? What storytelling techniques, whether structural or narrative or visual, does the film perhaps share with other non-documentary films or genres, such as the sports film? What was the students' understanding about some of the issues or themes that are explored within the film prior to watching the documentary, and how has the documentary then altered those perceptions? And drawing on the students' own experience of watching other films within the documentary genre, what similarities or differences might they have noticed in this film's approach from other documentaries they may have seen? And as I mentioned in the synopsis at the beginning of the presentation, films like Spellbound, the Spelling Bee focused documentary, or The King of Kong, a documentary from 2007 about competitors from around the world playing Donkey Kong. It's a great film if you've not seen it. It's almost like Rocky, but in the world of video games. And two films very similar that both came out in 2018, focusing on youth attending science competitions, Science Fair and Inventing Tomorrow, which played as part of the MIFF Schools program back in 2018 or 2019 from memory. Another important context, I think, certainly for students who are coming to terms with the idea of creative intentions, directorial voice, the process of filmmaking, how filmmakers use the language of cinema to create meaning, would be to delve a little into the film's production background. So here I think interviews with the director, in this case Christina Kraskov, may enhance students' understandings of that creative process and her intentions for the film. And here she gives a little bit of background to the documentary, published in an interview for The Independent magazine, and another there I've listed from filmobsessive.com, and both of those I'll refer to at various points in this presentation. But here she says, "I read an article saying this kid is the best in Australia at Excel and he's going to compete in the World Championships. I'd never heard of any competition like this and I had a million questions. Generally, when I learn about a topic and I have a million questions, I do a bit of a deep dive and see if there's any story there. I really thought there must be a film about this because it's so wild and interesting. From the start, it has everything. It has a ticking time bomb competition. It has amazing, passionate nerds. It has a global context and technology. And yet, there was no film. So I thought, oh, I should make this film." There you go. A bit of an insight into from little things, big things grow. Students should also be focused on those film techniques and the terminology that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So, for example, cinematography. What are the types of shots used? The use of focus, the use of different angles, the use of compositions, the use of camera movement. How does all of those elements of the film's visual style shape the film's connection to the audience? How does it advance the storytelling? How does it represent the subjects within the film? So, for example, close-up shots to really foster that identification between the audience and the subjects, or the use of wide angles to provide a greater sense of setting and context from where these various subjects come from. Now, normally when I talk about high angle and low angle in a sort of narrative or fictional film, we talk about, high angle shots where the camera looks down on characters to diminish their sense of power or status within the narrative, and low angle shots where the camera looks up at characters to enhance that sort of stature. Here, this is where that important third element in the identify the technique, have a basic understanding of its general function, and then apply that to the specific context of the film becomes crucial. Because I don't think the use of the high angle shot in this particular moment within the film, where we're in Greece and Kraskov's camera is capturing these tourists or trendsetters or beachgoers on the coast, is intended to diminish their status. And this is where you need students to be able to apply that knowledge and that understanding of a technique to the particular context in which it's being used. However, the low angle shot, in order to capture Delapay and his friends as they're singing, this introduction that we get of him in the context of Cameroon, I do think has the effect of enhancing his stature on this moment. Whereas if that same moment had been captured with a high angle shot, I don't think we'd have the same feeling towards his character. It wouldn't capture that same sense of elation and the importance of music to him, which is what he's talking about in that moment. So again, students need to have the ability to be able to apply that knowledge to the specific context in which these techniques are being used. To think about composition, like we have in that middle image of Mason in the background with his teacher. What does that particular composition, for example, tell us about him as a subject? We're at a remove, not quite a wide angle remove, but we are at a distance and he's framed through the doorway and we only see his teacher with him. What does that tell us about his bookworm status, his scholarly pursuits, maybe his isolation or difference from other classmates? What sets him apart? And again, context is key here, but students should be mindful of how the camera frames and lends meaning to the subjects as they're presented within the film. And of course, camera focus as well. Could be something as simple as highlighting detail, or camera focus could produce other meanings depending on the context. So students should be on the lookout for all of these things. But this focus on techniques could also be applied specifically to the film's generic background as a documentary, to how certain cinematic techniques that are common to documentary filmmaking and how their usage contributes meaning within Spreadsheet champions, whether that's interviews with professionals that are interspersed throughout the film, the use of intertitles or text in place of exposition to the camera, drawing on archival footage, the use of B-roll. So if the one-to-one interviews are A-roll or the action, then B-roll captures a sense of place perhaps, or mood or tone or cultural elements like we have here in this shot from Cameroon. We also have the use of graphics, which become hugely important in the climactic competition sequence. How are they being used? What's their storytelling function? How are they being used to add a sense of drama, perhaps, to the narrative? We also need to consider aspects of music, and another key element to consider, which gets back to cinematography, is the use of the handheld camera technique. So rather than every shot being mounted on a static camera, often we see Kraskov following the subjects live, holding the camera, following them in their day-to-day lives or in the lead-up to the competition. So the use of that handheld cinematography has a very different connotation, a different feel to static camera work. It provides a greater sense of immediacy. Does that lend a sense of authenticity to the film? Again, these are all elements that students need to consider when focusing on these key film techniques and the language of cinema and how it's being applied in this specific context. I would also encourage students to think about the narrative structure. So thinking about how filmmakers, certainly documentary filmmakers, put together a film. Documentary, just like narrative films, follow certain storytelling tradition. Is the documentary structured like fictional narrative films? Does it follow the traditions of the classic Hollywood narrative of the beginning, middle, and end, that 3-act structure? How does the film establish the subjects and their personal lives, the rules of the competition, and the impact on competitors? How does the editing and the ordering of events contribute to the build-up of that drama or that tension or the revelations or resolutions that occur along the way? So I would have students either taking notes during the screening to refer back to in class, or certainly in that post-screening context, come back and try and reconstruct the ordering of events as they're presented within the film. Now, there are obviously far more story elements than I've been able to reflect here in 9 screenshots, but we have things like the introduction of the competition. We have the reference to where it's going to take place, Orlando, Florida. We get some shots of the kind of setup of the competition. And then we move into the introduction of each of the subjects. Exposition about the exam itself, followed by background information about technology and spreadsheets and the development of Microsoft Office. And we move to the finals, to the exam day, to the awards day, to the afterward. So again, there's a very deliberate ordering of events here. And I think students should reflect upon why the film is structured in this particular way. As Kraskov elaborates, I think we knew that the stakes in the drama would be there after enough research and talking to them, the students. We knew that winning meant scholarships and life-changing job offers and things like that. After getting to know them more, I guess you're looking for that subtext. You always write out how you want the story to go, how you envision it going. In documentary shoots, it never really goes that way, but that's your backup if it doesn't. So you try to learn as much as you can and plan out how to realize those ideas, and then you usually get something even better. That's exactly what happened. I think that's some important background information into the process of documentary filmmaking. One of the other key concepts that I mentioned at the beginning of film analysis is the notion of mise-en-scène, which basically involves everything within the visual design of the film, from lighting to composition to setting to, in this case, clothing and design and so on. So while we often attribute meaning to production designers and art designers and set dressers in terms of the creation of mise-en-scène, it's really no different in terms of documentary. What is represented on screen conveys meaning, whether the filmmaker intended it or not. So, in this case, analysing the mise-en-scène of a documentary. How does the film convey a sense of the personality of the various subjects or their cultural backgrounds through the visual design in which they're situated, say in these interview scenarios? Do we gain a different perspective on the subjects once they're all brought together for the competition? So you could look at the mise-en-scène of each individual's room. What does this tell us about their fascinations, their hobbies, their obsessions, their socioeconomic situations? Think about Mason and this sort of almost wide-angle shot of him in his room surrounded by technology. Carmina surrounded by pink objects and her little sort of shrine to One Direction. De La Paix's room in Cameroon. They all give us sort of suggestions, I think, intimations about each of them as subjects or characters within a documentary. And I think it's really important to impress upon students this idea that even though we often or traditionally think about documentaries as aiming to present reality as is, there are constant creative decisions that are made by the filmmakers regarding what is shown on camera and then what is left out, whether at the time or in the editing process. A key focal point, I think, of classroom discussion will inevitably focus on the individual subjects within the film. So what's our initial impression of the various subjects? Not just the competitors, but the event staff who we follow throughout this journey, the family members, the specialized people from various fields who are referred to at various points, and have students elaborate on perhaps what are some of the key differences between these various participants and how might those social, cultural, or gender differences impact each subject's chance of success. So here we have the 6 key subjects: Mason from America, Alkmene from Greece, Braden from Australia, Nam from Vietnam, Carmina from Guatemala, and Della Pay from Cameroon. And then Steve, Bing, and Dominique are the key event staff that we see and are referred to throughout the film. And as Kraskov explains, we wanted to get a wide variety of competitors with really different personalities, cultures, geographies, support systems, and strengths and weaknesses. We pre-interviewed them all, and the 6 we ended up going with were just so unique from each other. I think we nailed it. I think it's a good spread. And I think she's right. So not just the subjects themselves, but I think it's worth delving into how each subject is framed through their introduction and their cultural background. So thinking again about the visual language, the shots that have been selected to represent each of these individuals in a very short space of time and anchor them to that cultural background. So in what ways does the film draw on immediately recognizable imagery to locate these subjects within their differing cultures? How does the film also perhaps challenge certain stereotypes or pre-existing notions that the students may have had about these various geographic or cultural backgrounds? And I think there's an interesting tension in this film between resorting to recognizable scenarios or iconography, so like USA, American flag. Here we have Mason's eating a hamburger, that most American of meals, creating recognizable and immediate associations with the audience's familiarity with US culture. Australia, Outback, Braden and his brother playing soccer, Braden hoeing into a hamburger or a steak. Again, very cultural, but also creating connections outside of those diverse cultures. And we see that again with Greece. The Greece flag, Alkmene taking photos by the beach and cooking with her mother. So the film creates difference and points of connection in its selection of imagery. I think students should really interrogate how each of the 6 main subjects, is framed in respect of these kind of cultural differences and cultural similarities. There is also a focus on family throughout the documentary. So asking students to consider, what are some of the similarities in the presentation of family across the film? What pressures and responsibilities do the subjects feel in relation to family? And in what ways do the parents of the competitors provide a source of comfort or reassurance, or a source of pressure as well? How do the different individuals shown within the film respond to those pressures? What are some of the parental pressures, perhaps, that the students took upon themselves or felt as a sort of a burden that they were taking into the competition? Again, thinking about similarities and differences in terms of these characters and their representation along the theme or the focus of family. And here, Kraskov gives a bit of interesting background information from a documentary filming perspective, where she says, I think some parents were a little bit unsure because it's a bit of a scary thing to have strangers come from halfway around the world in your house with a camera and ask a lot of questions. But we were just really honest and upfront. I just talked about my other work. I also did a thesis for my master's on documentary ethics. So I just tried to say that treating subjects correctly and fairly and honestly was really important to me. We just took it slow and we just told them roughly what would happen and asked them if they were okay with that at every stage. And we ended up becoming really good friends. It was a really good process. So there's a bit of an insight into the logistics that goes into producing a film like this. I think one of the interesting focal points in this is the kind of social connotations for these varying subjects, and this focus that comes up, or this reference that comes up at various points to the term nerd or similar ones. So I think students should consider, does this carry a pejorative meaning within the film, or does it become a term of endearment? So what meanings perhaps might the students associate with the term nerd or similar labels like geeks? And how might we interpret this film reclaiming those words in a way? In what ways does this film challenge notions of what is quote-unquote normal or abnormal? To what extent are the various participants outsiders? And does the documentary work to deconstruct those stereotypes about intelligence? And here are 2 examples of interviews where this comes to the fore. Mason says at one point, I'm a complete nerd. I'm a very social nerd at that. You can ask my friends. Mason is a gem, by the way, in this documentary. And Steve, one of the event's organisers, makes the observation, so you have this group of people who might be nerds, they're geeks, and all these other labels that may apply to them. And yet they are in so many ways just like their peers, in that they're still adolescents. I think students could certainly dig into both of those quotes. And Kraskov as well chimes in on this and says, I think the word nerd means someone who's kind of brave and they don't care about what's normal. That was me. Not with Excel spreadsheets, unfortunately, but I was so passionate about things. As a teenager, I didn't understand why these things weren't cool when they were so cool to me. I think everyone at some point in their lives has felt like an outsider and has felt misunderstood. So it was about calling out what you might think they are. Mason on the surface, he's a big nerd, but then we show you who he really is, and he's amazing. I think most audiences, if not all, will be able to relate to exactly what Kraskov's saying there. The theme of success or failure is certainly one that emerges over the course of the film. So asking students to consider, how do each of the differing subjects appear to define success or failure? In the context of the film, what does it mean to be a winner? In what ways do some of the subjects feel pressured or additional pressure to succeed? Do any of the subjects appear to change their view or reflect upon the meanings or value of success after the competition? Does the documentary challenge or question the idea of a level playing ground between the various competitors? So the opening image of the film is a table covered in trophies. And we have one of the Greek coaches at one point tell his sort of cohort, you're already winners for being here. And at the end, we come to the award ceremony. Does our idea of success that's sort of seeded through that opening image change by the end? I should say the image I've chosen from the award ceremony is not connected to the 6 subjects in question. It's from a different competition. So it's not a spoiler. I'm not giving away anything in that image. And there are a number of other avenues for further discussion that's prompted by this film. Various cultural, social, or technical references that I think could be explored in greater depth within that classroom context in order to really deepen students' understandings of the documentary. So it touches on elements of mental health, of the kinds of technical or technological applications involved with Excel and AI, whether that's astrophysics or in the medical fields. There's also a reference to the Fibonacci sequence at one point. If students aren't familiar with that, that could certainly be followed up on in classroom context. The film also touches on issues to do with language and language barriers, of gender and wealth inequality, of access to education and to music. Again, primarily through Delapay, but that could certainly be a springboard for a wider discussion or analysis about the cultural place of music in some of these countries. And without giving anything away in terms of the ending of the film, what impression does Kraskov leave us with at the end of the film? So what's the tone of the ending? Is there a sense of resolution and optimism, or do doubts and ambiguities over the subjects' respective futures persist? And again, like I say, in every film class, students should really be encouraged to come up with a range of interpretations in their responses. And I think Kraskov's commentary here from her interview in The Independent is worth quoting, as she says, I hope that if there's someone who has different interests or doesn't quite feel like they fit in, that they come away feeling seen and valued, and that there is a world for them somewhere. I hope people come away being a bit more open-minded about how we stereotype people, like nerds. And mostly, I think the younger generation get a lot of bad press. That's always been happening since there's been different generations. But I did learn so much from these kids. I really do hope people feel optimistic about the future, knowing that these kids are in it. They're so passionate. I hope the audience comes away feeling really good about that too. Well said. And in terms of unifying the various elements from this presentation into a form of assessment, I think students could be tasked with both reading and critically engaging with other published reviews of this film or other films, and then respond by writing their own. Again, drawing on not only their close analysis of the film, which is obviously going to come out in more detail in that classroom discussion, but utilising the kinds of terminology and techniques that I've made reference to throughout this presentation, and those visual literacy skills and those strategies of critical analysis. And here's an example from a review of the film from the But Why Though website from Ricardo Gallegos, who writes, "Given that Microsoft Excel is often associated with dull office work, a documentary about teenagers and young adults battling in the Microsoft Office Specialist World Championship for spreadsheet dominance might not sound like the most exciting of film adventures. But in Spreadsheet Champions, director Christina Kraskoff turns this premise into a highly entertaining and heartfelt film about dedication, dreams, and passion. Spreadsheet Champions does a great job of presenting all of the competitors. You get to know their personalities, motivations, and fears, as well as the context around them, which is key to helping us understand how their triumph could change their individual lives or even those around them." End quote. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, head on over to miff.com.au/schools, where you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so, on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very enjoyable and, more importantly, educationally rewarding experience at this year's film festival. Thanks so much.